I'm really happy to be here, and although I have spoken to maybe 100 events, it's been a while, so I'm going to except for teaching. So it's the first time I have to say that I'm doing it out on my own in private practice, so that was exciting. So anyway, this presentation is called Substance Abuse Amongst Teens and Military Families. I just want to show of hands to see how many of you are familiar with military culture. Some people that I worked with. And obviously teens. Yes, all of you are teens, right? You work here. And anybody with military teens? You. And anybody with military teens with substance abuse issues? Okay, so now I'll be able to give information that everyone can use. It's a very specific population, and there's not a lot of research on it, actually. They're just beginning to come out with some research based out of the USC adjunct area in San Diego, and they're still looking to see what kinds of treatment programs will be working for this particular population. So I'm just going to share with you what I know. Okay, so the objectives for today are to discuss the development of the teen brain and its associated behaviors, to help you become more familiar with the family system in the military culture, and to share some vignettes that we've encountered in our practice, and then to just describe some intervention and prevention tools that will help you in basically over a multi-pronged approach, which is really the only way that you can handle this population. So I definitely need to make some thank yous. Sovereign Health for seeking me out. I don't know really how they found me, but I'm glad. So Dr. Melinda Morgan, who was a colleague of mine who worked at Focus, she is incredible, and a lot of the fancy slides that are about the brain come from her, because I don't know how to make fancy slides, so you'll see fancy slides and then you'll see non-fancy slides, and you'll know which one belongs to which. I want to say thank you to the Focus program, for which I worked for nearly 5 years. It's a prevention program for military families. There are a number of different locations around the world. I worked from the beginning in Hawaii, developing lots of interventions, and I moved over to San Diego. There are 2 locations in San Diego, if you're ever wanting to find out more about them, at 32nd Street with the Navy, and then at Pendleton. Actually at Miramar a bit too. And then I want to just thank University of Phoenix, because through my work with them, which is just initiated, I've been able to do a lot of investigating into substance abuse and chemical dependency, which I really enjoyed. And then the PHHF team, so some of them are here. And who is PHHF? That's my private practice, and it's the longest name ever. I don't know why I made it that long, but it's called Preventative Health for Happy Families. And they don't even let me put the exclamation part when I'm doing insurance. So anyways, we go by PHHF. And there's a little duplication showing up right there. These are our websites. It's one website, but you can find it under my name, devinpricemft.com, or health for, number 4, happyfamilies.com. And in there you'll find some information, some tools, and just more about the practice. You'll see here there's a few different images. We really specialize with the military families, and I'll talk about that. There's a lot of stuff with military families systemically that we work with, whether it be injury, challenges with deployments, transitions and changes. So that's kind of something that we really put our energy into. Insurance-wise, we're referring out. We take TRICARE and the VA and other ones as well. I put these 2 images on the left because with the work that we do with teens, a lot of it has to do with helping them with perfectionism and how to overcome that with the techniques of mindfulness. So we do a lot of mindfulness techniques in our practice. Is also very useful for PTSD and working with the military. All right, so teenage brain is still under construction. It is not ready to go yet. And basically, many of you may or may not know that by the time when a teen is about 13 to 15 years old, they're only about 80% of the way in with their development, that brain. So it could sound good, they're 80% in, but not the problem, but the issue is that last 20%, that last bit, is basically the prefrontal cortex. And that means that basically the executive functioning in their brain is not fully developed. So what does that mean? Well, this is what happens in the prefrontal cortex. Impulse control. Judgment, decision-making, planning, organization, sequencing, empathy, and guilt. How does that apply to substance abuse? Any ideas?
Guilt.
Guilt.
Part of the case, just diagnosis or alcohol.
So if they're not able to access those different areas in their prefrontal cortex, how might that impact their substance abuse? Yes?
They put themselves in horrible situations over and over and expect to make it through, which they do most of the time, but eventually it comes up.
Absolutely. So they can't control their impulses. Boy, oh boy. Their judgment is not quite sound. Their decision-making along with that, basically we'll talk about where they go with their decisions. They don't plan, right? They are not organized. They don't understand the sequence of events. That means the outcome. So basically, they're not set up for success when it comes to substance abuse. So it's not fully developed basically until their 20s. And some people say that it's not developed until their 30s, depending on who they are. So you can imagine some of the people that you may or may not know who are in their 20s, they're adults, they're married, they're with kids, military especially, married with kids at 19, and their brains aren't even fully developed. Something to think about. So teenage years characterized by impulsivity. Also, these are the ones that really apply to substance abuse, sensation seeking. Everyone likes a good sensation from now and then. But when it comes to teens, I think the sensations are a bit more. So one of the pieces in the brain, as we know, as those of you who are substance abuse experts, has to do with dopamine, the neurotransmitter that gives us that feeling of, oh, I feel so good, right? And so the pleasure center, the reward center, and we know, not necessarily with teens, but those who are really with the disease of substance dependency and chemical dependency, the dopamine reward center is disconnected from the prefrontal cortex telling you that we need to wait for our rewards, basically. So you've got an impulsive kid who's enjoying how much it feels good, and basically, woo, they're having lots of fun, right? So that's great. They're feeling happy and having lots of fun, but here's the deal. They definitely recognize that they're mortal, but they value the reward more. So who feels like they were valuing the reward more in their teens? Who? So some people may be younger. Maybe they valued the reward only up until they were 10. Anybody? Okay. Up until they were 20? Okay, I'm going to raise my hand. I valued the reward up until I was maybe 35. I won't lie. I like to feel good, and I like the reward. So this is something to think about. I don't know if I got my last 100% when I hit 35 or what, but basically I recognized I was mortal, but I like to have a lot of fun. So this is why this actually pertains to, this is very interesting to me, and I like studying this quite a bit. So someone said once, Lauren Steinberg, the teenage brain is like a car with a good accelerator but weak brakes. Basically that applies to the development of the brain that's only 80% in. So here's some stats. Teenagers are 4 times as likely as older drivers to be involved in a crash and 3 times as likely to die. These are some grim stats I'm going to go through. With alcohol abuse rates amongst teens are high relative to other ages. Teens are more likely than adults to use substances. And 20 to 25% of teens are reported to binge monthly. Get them in a car, right? When it comes to marijuana, there was a study done in 2011 that basically in terms of using pot, marijuana, weed, ganja, whatever way you want to phrase it, 7% of the 8th graders had or were currently using regularly, 18% of 10th graders, and nearly a quarter of 12th graders were using pot. And more than half of those teens obtained marijuana for free, or by sharing with someone else, usually a friend. So there wasn't even the need to save up money. It was just readily available in the high school. And I think we can think about the other substances also, but I'm not going to really go into those too much. But I want to say that although all these things are grim and there's a lot going on with substance abuse, there's a lot of normality with teens. And we talk about that with the parents. It is normal for teens to jump to conclusions. It is normal for them to be self-centered, right? And overly dramatic and engage in risky behavior. So if you, again, preventatively, so I'll be talking a bit about that, prep the parents for this kind of stuff, educate them about the brain, educate them about where they are in their development, it will help the parents get prepared ahead of time. So I'm going to, and that's stuff that's really not specific to military, it's just the general way that teens operate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about military life. In the military, there is what we call the deployment cycle or spiral. And this is a slide that's been borrowed from Focus. I feel like I worked for them long enough, I'm going to use their slide. It's basically the idea from the National Military Family Association, who developed this model that with each deployment, depending on the child's age, let's say they start in infancy, toddler years, they go through the first deployment. They go through the deployment with a parent who's separated from his or her spouse. That parent's probably quite young, typically. And that parent's probably quite overwhelmed. More overwhelmed than a person who's got two parents. More than a child that has one parent, single parent. It's a child who has a parent who's worried about their spouse, who watches the news, who's at a high level of anxiety, trying to, attach to her child. I worked with families in Hawaii. In Hawaii, they moved to Hawaii because that's where their spouse had been moved to. It's called Oconus, right? So they go to Hawaii, the rest of their family is on the mainland, and you've got this 19-year-old girl taking care, and one of them was actually on my staff, taking care of a baby. There's no support system there, right? So they end up having a really hard time as a parent, and it really impacts attachment. And we all know, if you're working with children, attachment is critical to the development of a child and a personality. So then we go to cycle number 2. So here it happens again. The spouse is probably really not looking forward to it. Now it's the second time, probably cranky about the whole thing happening. Anxiety is mounting before the deployment cycle has even happened. Possibly there is a struggle in the marriage at this point, and the toddler's got a parent who is, again, maybe or maybe not, stressed during the deployment. Perhaps this person has developed skills because there's so many great programs now out there, but a lot of times it's still a huge challenge. We get to deployment number 3, and these kids have really probably at this time moved once or twice. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we get to the teens, and that's where we're going to talk about how the military teens are operating, because a lot of times they've already been through 4 deployments and probably a number of moves, but I'm going to talk about some stats about that in a minute. So there's things to think about with returning service member. Is life changing for them? Obviously, they've gone out a lot of times out into what they call in theater, a place where it's very scary, but also, maybe what they wanted to do their whole career, maybe there's a letdown. Most likely there's been a number of losses with friends, with their actual command. It's definitely something that is an experience that a lot of us civilians will never understand as much as we study it. They don't get their basic common comforts. I just had a reintegration with a spouse and his wife, and she just got done raising a toddler, and he was on a deployment on a MU, which means he's attached to a carrier and he flies. And during that, he was an officer, and he got to go on email a couple times a week, but he was an officer flying a very important plane, and he got high privilege. But enlisted, they'd be waiting in lines to be able to send an email to their spouse, and often didn't get to. So there's a huge disconnect. Just basic, our phones are our brain. I said if an alien came down and looked up our population, they would assume that these are actually our brains, because we don't function without them. So obviously there's a challenge there with what's going on when they're out in the war zone. The war zone, obviously, I'm sure you've heard a lot about it. People come back with missing limbs. People have had to pick their buddies up out of a tree after they have died. There are stories that you would not believe, and I try very hard not to cry when I hear them. And these are stories, these are things that will never go away, ever. They will learn how to develop tools, hopefully, but these are memories, and this is what PTSD is all about. They could come back with physical injury. They will likely come back with a psychological injury that is actually invisible. So no one can even tell that they're injured because they look just fine. But PTSD is an injury. It is an injury to the brain, where the brain often learning, the spouse will also have expectations about what they're coming back home to. They've probably been looking forward quite a bit to being back with the family. Most times what they expect is quite different because they have basically missed out on formative years in their kids' lives. A person will come back and their kid is not even, the kid does not even recognize the person coming back because he was only 2 when he was a baby or a toddler. Now he's 3, doesn't really recall who that parent is. It's heartbreaking to someone coming back from work. And when they come back, they often will be preoccupied with deployment, which means they are disconnected, disengaged with the family because their minds are on what had happened. They miss their buddies. They want to connect with them. They don't feel like they have anything in common with the family. And like I said, they miss witnessing key developmental milestones with the family. What about the parent at home? Well, life goes on, right? Life goes on for the parent at home. There's a joke amongst military spouses that as soon as, this is a female military spouse, as soon as her husband leaves, her car will break down. It's like an equation. It just happens every single time. Or the washing machine or the dryer will bust. Every single time it happens. And they have to learn how to deal with these things on their own. They do double duty, obviously, as a parent. They're exhausted. They handle crises. They handle crises on their own. Oh, sometimes they'll let their spouse who's away know about the crisis because they want their involvement, and that can be really actually distracting for the service member who's away. And other times they will abstain from talking to the person who's on deployment because they don't want them to worry. So this deliberation can also be really challenging for the spouse at home. There's definitely behavioral and emotional difficulties typically with the children. We're only going to talk about the teens, but with the boys, there's often behavioral problems in the schools, and with the girls, it's not, and this is just generally, the girls, they often internalize, they have somatic complaints, they have stomach problems, they have headaches, they're often not wanting to go to school. And then we also have a lot of separation anxiety that starts to occur with the kids. Am I talking too fast for anybody? I'm going to pack in a punch for this hour that we've got. So also the parent at home will have expectations. Again, there will probably be some surprises at how the expectations are not met. They call it the honeymoon cycle that occurs at first, and that can last from like 2 days to maybe 3 months, but then it's back to business and there can actually be some clashing because the person that was away doesn't know what kind of new rules were developed. How does he or she fit into the new family structure? With the spouse who's been at home, where's the effing credit? Like all this work that he or she has done, and the service member just wants to go to sleep. Because why? Sleep deprivation occurred, but not very many thank yous for what you've done. Doesn't look around to see how clean the house has been. You know, doesn't notice the little black dress that's put on in return. There's just a lot of things that they don't really understand in terms of the person who's been left at home. They have to develop a new normal, because nothing is what it once was. And there's lots of programs that really help with this. With reintegration now, there's fabulous programs. And if they can be prepared for this, things are not so challenging. But these are the things that have happened traditionally. Okay, adolescents. Adolescents will often feel rejection, anger, and sometimes denial about this. I've worked with teens who've been through a few deployments. They're most frequently saying, whatever. It doesn't matter to me, no big deal. Because they become so used to that parent being away. They often almost always have parentified issues. So they start helping out, they start helping to raise their little brother or sister. They have a lot of added adult responsibilities. I say this almost every lecture I give. The parent who's leaving says, especially for the boys, you'll be the man of the house, and that messes them up beyond repair because they're not men, they're teens, and then they're getting mixed messaging about what their responsibilities are, and it makes for a big mess when the service member comes home. Also with the teen, there's been so many at this point, birthdays, holidays, vacations, missed, physical changes, basketball championships, all kinds of things that meant a lot to that kid, and their parent wasn't there. They have more difficulty with parents' reintegration because they have basically become parentified, and they really have a lot of responsibilities, and they want to keep it up. And then all of a sudden they're told to be a kid again, and it's very confusing, and they're mad. They really are. So they say with the teens, they go through unchangeable changes. You can't go backwards at this point. This is who they've developed into. And a lot of times there is that I don't care attitude, that aloof, disconnected way of operating in terms of attaching to that parent. And then when they're not attached to a parent, they don't really seem to care about what the parent says, and they engage in a lot more risky behaviors. So the military teens are at very high risk for risky behaviors. So I want you to think about what, we talked about dopamine, we talked about arousal levels when you're a teen and all the impulsivity. With a teen who's in the military, those arousal levels are even higher, and they're high on an ongoing basis. Because when you have a parent who's in the military, you are in what's called a suspended animation. You are always alert. You're watching the news. You're worrying. You're trying to keep things up, and it's never, ever stopping. So your cortisol levels are very high when you're a teen on an ongoing way. They can't separate war from daily life. We can all turn the news on and off. I don't like to watch it. They can't do it. It's always going on in their minds. And they worry. They worry that the deployment will be suspended, which it almost always is. You think they're getting back in June, they're getting back in October. They are worried that the parent will be different, especially if they've been through a few deployments. And they also obviously worry that the parent's not coming home at all. And that happens. And then they also worry for the parent at home. And when they worry for the parent at home, they often will stifle those feelings and want to keep their cool so as not to worry the parent at home. And that makes for problems in terms of expression of feelings and getting it out, and it also can create, as we know, behaviors that are maladaptive. So they'll start to rebel. And we will talk about rebellion, what rebellion looks like, but often it's substance abuse and risky behaviors. And like I said, they have a lot of extra duties at home, and they attempt to instill confidence in themselves and everyone else, and they often create an expectation of themselves that's way too high and unrealistic. They feel like a failure ultimately because they can't meet up with it. So, like I said, there's not a lot of research in terms of substance abuse with military teens, but there was a recent study done by Ron Astor out of USC. And the results show that overall military-connected youth have a higher prevalence of substance abuse. That was basically one of the outcomes. Several associations between substance use, prevalence in military connections, specifically lifetime alcohol, marijuana, and prescription drug use according to military connection status. And the results indicate that experiences associated with deployment of a family member may increase the likelihood of substance abuse. So if there's deployments going on, especially if it's in war zones, that will heighten it. And those youth reported having a sibling in the military were the ones who had the highest rate of substance abuse. And they don't really know, they're going to further investigate why the sibling is more threatening to them than the parent. And I don't have my head completely wrapped around it, but I can imagine they weren't expecting someone that is near peer level to be at risk and at safety, so they interject that as a possibility they can go through something like that as well. That's my guess. All right, treatment.
Question.
Yeah, sir.
In regards to the sibling, possibly like it being an older brother, which is a role model,
Yeah.
could be something that's more substantial.
It could be. Well, there's different kind of connectivity with your sibling, right? I mean, they say siblings are like the blood is thicker than water. The siblings have the greatest connectivity because they're genetically the same. So that's a good point. And I don't know. I think that perhaps also they think of someone as a parent as someone who contains them and should go out into dangerous zones and have the ability to endure it, whereas maybe a sibling wasn't supposed to go out there and do that kind of thing.
Maybe just get closer to the sibling.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone they shared a bedroom with, and grew up with for their whole life. Yeah.
So, I'm trying to wrap my head around, because I
Yeah.
grew up with this, but what is normal? Like, okay, I'm a teenager, my dad's been in the military all my life. Is it normal when dad's home? Is it normal when dad's not home? Or are there two normals?
I would say there's no normal.
So it's like kind of being around domestic violence, you're constantly...
It's like that suspended animation. We all know that we need containment, we need consistency, we need structure in order to properly develop, to develop as we would want for a teenager, right?
Right.
But that suspended animation and that constant change. I don't believe in normal period. I can't stand that word. No offense. But I don't think there is much of a normal, because even once the service member leaves the military, their whole identity changes as well. You know, then that's a whole, I'm not even going to talk about that, but transitioning into the veteran world is a whole other ballgame. They have, everything changes. But I can't say that there is a normal. How about you two people who work with me in the military world? Kristen, do you think there's a normal for a team?
No, it just keeps evolving. So that is their new normal. It's just wherever they're at, that becomes what we're dealing with. So then it just cycles into the next normal. You just say the next state or development period or spiral or cycle. So you don't typically use normal either, but then that becomes what they have.
So it's kind of like okay, this is the situation, this month, we're gonna run with these
6 to 7 month period,
Right.
and then you go into the next period, like she said. So a team may get comfortable for those 6 or 7 months where they're the older parent for the younger kids, and then mom or dad comes home and they're like, okay, and she said, be a kid again. So he's like, okay, well, I've been acting like an adult for 6 or 7 months, and now you want me to go back and act like a 13-year-old? So they can't wrap their head around it, so they go into going with these resentments and how they're feeling, and then they go into the next one, dad's gone again, and mom's like, I need you to be that parent again. So it's constantly changing and evolving, as they say. There's the period of time is not long enough for them to think of it as normal.
So what is their worldview then? Is the world safe or is it hostile?
I think that's independent to the child. I mean, there's organic factors, or how they were raised, or how prepared the parents were for this, how much preventative tools are used for the kid. It's every child and teen, and as I think most clinicians, we approach them all differently. I work from an eclectic standpoint where you apply the appropriate intervention and tools to the kid or the adult. I think the same goes. And it's not, we call it a spiral, not necessarily a cycle, because the spiral, it builds on each other, but it heightens and lowers on each other too. And like divinity, these two, Kristen and Divinity, we're focused still. Like she was saying, 6 months are typical, but that's typical for the Marine Corps. And then there's like 8 to 9 months, which are maybe typical for the soldiers in the Army, actually a year. And then there is the Navy, and they go on missions, and they disappear. The SEALs just disappear without any warning. They wake up, oh, Dad's gone. I don't know when he's coming back. Super secretive. So I'll talk a little bit about knowing the culture. But in terms of the children, I don't think there can be anything considered as normal. I don't really think anything is normal, but especially for what they go through. Yeah, across the board. And I know, I mean, there's things that we can do. We can become more educated in this and become more prepared in this. But every day working in this field is a new piece of education you get. Every session I have, I'm like, oh gosh, I didn't tell you that. You know, which it makes the role that I have and people who work in this field very exciting. You know, if you'd like to, like I said, I don't know if my last 20% is fully developed. I like the excitement. I like the cortisol of working with this military population. So I'm going to talk about treatment for military teens with substance abuse. So it's going to entail a few prongs, and they often talk about substance abuse needing a multi-pronged approach. I'm going to talk about cultural awareness, and then system. So I'm an MFT, and MFT is where we get high on the idea of systems, and we believe in systems. We don't believe that everyone is treated individually, and we're not pathology oriented. So I'm going to talk about systems. So systemically, there's a social environment component for a team, and then there's also the family system that we'll talk about. And then I'll mention briefly some of the individual interventions I imagine you're all very savvy in, so I'm only going to go into them a little bit. I'm going to give some vignettes to give you examples of what some of these substance abuse families who are in the military go through, and then kind of briefly mention support systems. But let me take a break before I get into this. Any questions, any further questions about military culture? Anybody in here have a military client that they've had come through these doors?
I worked we treated a lot of Alaska kids when I was in Idaho. Because we were medically managed, we were in hospital settings, we could call that type of diabetics. But a huge portion of those guys are
From Alaska?
Yeah.
I guess it's Army.
I Air Force, Army.
Air Force.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's definitely different.
Like for them to like come from Alaska, drop into a hospital setting, everything's brand new, they dropped in really easy. Like, they adjusted really
Yeah.
well.
Well, I will add to this, that although there are so many challenges that a military kid or family go through, they are the most resilient and adaptable persons you'll probably come across. And they've gone through so much, they've had to learn skills at on a different level. So they handle change real well. Yeah, so the other thing I was going to mention, there's a slide on it. Okay, so if you get someone in the military, and I recommend you write these down, these websites down, or ping me later and I'll send you the links. You need to know your client and you need to know this culture. So I know I don't like to say the word need, but you need to train in this culture if you're going to go into it in any shape or form. So if you get an incoming client who's a vet or active duty with kids, before you get started, start updating yourself on current military culture. These are two websites that are great. One comes out of the VA. The bulk of my clients are out of the VA, which is different than active duty, but they are the ones who often have like the real diagnosed PTSD. There's a lot you can learn from that. And then also there's a toolkit and then just a training. You get CEUs for it too. There's 4 levels that you can learn on that second bullet. And then Star Providers is a program that comes out of UCLA. Focus, the program that we work for, is a UCLA developed program, and now they have something else called starproviders.org, and that has 3 tiers of training, and you get CEUs as well for those, and you'll learn military culture on the first level, but as you get to the 3rd level, you'll really learn actual interventions for working with PTSD. It's free. And then also there's a provider referral service that comes out of it. The bottom line is if you don't know something, ask. Don't nod your head like you know, because then they're going to think you know, and then they're going to refer to the acronym again and again and again, and you're going to have a disconnect with your client. Right? What's a debt? It's a detachment. What's an IA? It's when a service member gets attached to an actual battalion and they didn't belong. They're just on their own with no support system. There's all kinds of things that you would want to know. And it's a culture. I moved to Hawaii to start working in this field. My background was CalWorks. I got this job. Ooh, it's really fancy because I'm called a site director. And I took it, and I was excited because it got me to Hawaii. I was so into Lost at the time, I had to go. So I moved to Hawaii, and I was told, it's a whole other culture to live in Hawaii. And it's true. It's a whole other culture to live in Hawaii. But let me tell you, it's far more of a different culture to drive onto an installation. I lived in Hollywood. I lived with liberals. I lived with people who are all about art and all that kind of stuff. I got to Hawaii and I drove onto an installation where people have rifles right when you get on the installation. It's a whole other culture. Every single part of it is different than regular civilian life. So you definitely want to and it was scary for me, and then you have to dive in and just do it, but you need to keep on learning and learning and learning. But when you don't know, just ask, because lots of people like to actually share and tell what these things mean. It makes them understand that you have interest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the social situation and peer pressure that goes on with the military team. These are some interesting stats. By the time military children have grown, they will have moved at least twice during their high school years. Just those 4 years, they will have moved at least twice. That's changing schools. 3 different high schools in 4 years. How's their education going? They will have moved 6 to 9 times between kindergarten and 12th grade. That's crazy, right? That's not normal, I will say. How does that work with friends and maintaining friendships? In San Diego, a lot of kids who come in who are not military, they're civilian kids that come in to work with me at our practice, they also have a feeling of grief and abandonment because they have so many friends who are in the military who leave. So San Diego in general, we are a military, I think it's the largest number of military service members live in San Diego, in the world. So we, as civilians, have to know this culture, and your kids have to know this culture, even if they're not in the military. By the time a military child turns 18, he or she will have had to say goodbye to more significant people than the average person will have in a lifetime. That's called grief. So when you're working with them, you need to think about grief work as well. So they strive for a normal of wanting to fit in all the time. Think about kids who are just starting school, at a new school. They're nervous as heck. They feel the pressure that's on them. They will do what they can to fit in. This happens again and again and again and again. And one of the things that's constant in every single school, no matter where they go, is chemical and substance use. So they can dive right into that easily every single time. Oh, wait, this says something. Some brain scan studies suggest that teen brains react to peer exclusion in the same way they respond to threats to physical hunger. Feeling alone. In yoga, they call it your first chakra. You need to feel like you're surviving. And if you're not surviving by people around you, it's terribly frightening. So it's, at the neural level, it's perceived as a threat to your existence when you have peer pressure. And that's something that can relate to all of you working with teens. So, for many adolescents socializing without chemicals, I think I'm missing a word. No, I'm not. For many adolescents, socializing without chemicals to relieve anxiety is foreign to them. That's just the way you do it. You go to a party, you have a couple of beers. And maybe that's it. But social anxiety, we know that we do behavioral interventions to assist with substance abuse, and we know social anxiety is a big piece of it. So that's something that they use all the time to help with it. And it says if appropriate social skills are not developed, the adolescent is likely to slip back into the drug culture, where acceptance is based on only one criteria. All you have to do is use, and you're part of the group. That's pretty easy. It doesn't have to do with socioeconomics, it doesn't have to do with intelligence. It's just whether or not you want to use. So you're immediately fitting in. So I'm going to give a story, a vignette of a client I worked when I was in Hawaii. I made up her name, but Samantha for this situation. And Dad was on deployment. He was a gunny sergeant, and I don't know if you know what that means, but gunny sergeants are enlisted service members who made their way up the ranks and they become officers. And they're the ones who are tough as nails. They are the ones who have to basically shout and scream at the Marines. They're tough, and they've worked hard and long to get to that. But you'll refer to the gunny as being kind of like, the gunny did this, So her stepfather was a gunny sergeant, and he was on his 5th deployment, and it was his 5th deployment in a battle zone. So you can imagine how tough this guy was. And the mom brought her in because she got caught sneaking out of the house at the age of 13, and she was going to the skate park. This was in Hawaii. She would go hang out at the skate park with the other teens, and they got caught drinking beer. And they also got caught for vandalism, so they brought her in for that. She comes into her first session, and she was so goth. The girl had black eyes like this. She was wearing fishnet stockings. She's 13 years old, and she was tough, you know. And we began to work with her on this program, and we began to realize that the mom had changed all of her parenting skills while the gunny sergeant was away, because he was a very strict parent, probably not the kind of parenting style that I would recommend. So mom let it all change and fade away and do whatever she was used to doing, which is pretty loose because she was actually having free reign herself, and she wasn't monitoring the way her daughter was behaving and acting. She had other things, actually worried about the older brother because he was having school issues. So they came in and they worked with us, and after a while they developed good communication skills, and the teen, Samantha, she got back on track. And we were starting to prepare for the gunny sarge to come back. He comes back to session with the whole family. First of all, he didn't know why he was there because of deer headlights, but comes to the session, and Samantha, I did not recognize. Why? She was scrub clean. She looked like a preppy girl. I didn't even know who this person was. And she, as opposed to this kind of vociferous child who had a lot to share and say, was like this when she walked in the door. Totally different person. She didn't use anymore, but she was unhappy with the situation in the family, and she started sneaking out again. Any idea why she started sneaking? She wasn't sneaking out to use beer, drink beer, vandalize, nothing. Why was she sneaking out of the house? Any ideas? She was sneaking out in the morning early so she could go put her makeup on the way she used to at school. so she could maintain her identity that she had developed while he was away. This is an example of what teens go through with peer pressure. She couldn't change the way she looked and become, scrub clean. That wasn't her identity. So this is an example of how the military family operates when it comes to operational stress. There are primary direct effects, and then there's secondary effects in the family system. Military operations. So we have military operations that directly affect everybody. Obviously, it directly affects the service member because he or she is leaving to go out on a deployment, right? But it's not just deployments that directly affect the service member. It's the long hours they keep. It's how they have to move and pick up and go to different locations. There's a lot more than just deployment that affects the service member. It directly affects the spouse because this person does have to always prepare to change, does have to go seek out the new schools for the kids, does have to seek out what homes to look at, constantly affecting them when they have to do PCS, which stands, I don't know what it stands for, but it means moving. Permanent change of station, PCS. So it also affects the teens because they have to constantly move it. I already went through the examples how it affects the teens, but then there's a secondary effect that if the teen is being affected and they're starting to have problems in school, it upsets the spouse. She becomes highly stressed. If the spouse is stressed out about having to change schools, the spouse becomes easily off her track with parenting. And if the spouse is actually stressed, she or she can start giving attitude to the service member. And actually there's tertiary effects too. It just keeps going. Everyone is being impacted. It's systems, right? It's systems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you work with families. There's different kinds of families when it comes to substance abuse. There's what they call the functional family. They see the early stage of abuse and they connect it with a social or personal problem and they start getting treatment. There's the neurotic and enmeshed family. Anyone grew up in one of those? Okay, my hand goes super high. It's a stereotypical alcoholic family. There's all kinds of role reversals, there's protection, there's denial, and the children's role as a scapegoat is the evidence, basically, they use. And then there's the disintegrated family. And that's where there's this temporary separation from the abuser. They just say, okay, you go do your own thing. We got it, we're staying who we are. And then there's the absent family, which pretends that there's just nothing going on. Yeah, it's all fine, we don't know. So in terms of where the family is, there's stages of development and treatment. In the early stage, they don't see the drugs as problematic or injurious. They do have a need for support and education. Psychoed is really important for them to understand how drugs affect not just them, but not just the kid, but the family. And they need to put a focus on abstinence, right? They need to get the person sober and learn what resources are out there. And at the middle stage is actually when the families start going into treatment themselves, because we know it's a family disease, right? Does anyone here not believe it's a family disease? Someone, my friend, she doesn't think it's a family. She's clean after living on the streets, but she doesn't like that term family disease. But it's definitely a family disease from my point of view. At that point, there's like a real disheveled experience because everyone's like, what are we doing? We got to get this on track. Who am I? I don't even know who I used to be. Who is my kid? There's denial, there's blame, an acceptance that drugs have been in their life, and they have to continue with the psychoed as well. And there's grief because they have to start redefining their social networks, right? Maybe the parents can no longer have cocktail hour that they've always had in the home. And they have to start learning about relapse and triggers. And then in the late stage, if we are actually making it that far, they're often, in the late stage, they're not doing well. The members will be physically and emotionally ill and deal with multiple stressors. They could be disengaged, which means the family member is freed from having to do anything. There is differentiation, negotiation, conflict management, resolution of the past intimacy. There's a huge list of stages that go on at this point. A lot of the people who are in the family start to become ill because they're finally dealing with some stuff and it's overwhelming. Okay, so here's another vignette. This was given to me by one of my staff members who does telemedicine out of Hungary. That's a whole other way of doing clinical work, right? He used to to work for the Associated, for the Armed Services, YMCA. And she gave me this vignette. There's a mom who's 38. She was raised with parents who used. She currently is married to her husband who's 28. Just putting out the 10-year age difference. Her ex-husband's in long-term incarceration on drug charges. And when mom was in the first marriage, she was using meth, smoking it. But she stopped after the birth of her second child. So who knows how the kids are actually operating in terms of neural development. The husband came back from deployment and realized that she was using again, and he threatened divorce because not only was she using, she was accruing a lot of debt, which is actually something that often happens in the military, is this accruement of debt by the spouse. So she went into 30 days of rehab, and when she was released, she said she was good. Everything was just fine. How many times has that happened? My client just had to go back in after a year. But when she got out, she was also expected to participate in outpatient treatment for at least 6 months. So they went into outpatient treatment. And these were the kids that were involved. Maggie, 21, she's married to someone in the military herself, has 2 young children. Seth, who's 16, lives at home. And he actually was discovered to be using marijuana himself, with peers and by himself. And he was continuing to disconnect throughout time with the family situation. And then there's Alexis, who's 14. She lives at home as well, but she was hospitalized for cutting. And this is not a native cutting. She was hospitalized for cutting. So we have a lot going on as the trickle-down effect from parents with substance abuse occurs. So there's compounded effects. At the bottom, it talks about the cycle: instability, and then escape, and then there's a consequence. Then you go to rehab for repair, and then they deny that there's a problem. They go back to instability. So the substance abuse cycle is very challenging. I don't like it so much. I don't know. It's something that I do, but it's not what I choose to do regularly. It just kind of keeps coming in. So the kids at home were both parentified, right? It's a military family. They're parentified anyway, but now they're really parentified because the mom is like a child in terms of use and her parenting style. The kids who were at home said they felt disconnected as a family. The family always moves, there's deployment, there's absences. And the eldest daughter, who was married, was really hostile and dismissive of mom's work and very much doubtful that she would change. So in terms of the treatment, they determined that the family was in the pre-contemplated stage, maybe on the verge of contemplation. Mom was going through magical thinking, and she often identified the problems as being outside of herself. So the goal was to maintain sobriety, work with the kids to increase their tolerance, and work with the mom to increase the tolerance of the kids and quit scapegoating. To get the kids out into a positive support system and have the children build a sense of individual values and strengths. This is something also for military families, for military kids who wanted to identify their strengths. And the interventions were ongoing rapport, motivational interviewing, harm reduction, which I'm not a fan of, but that was what was done with this family. Mom did relapse at the end. She did put a realistic and balanced limit on how she parented. She went from being the fun mom to the overly strict mom, and then she found her middle ground. And Mom and Alexis, they got their relationship back on track. However, Seth disconnected more, and he was still using. And in terms of separation and termination, which often happens when working with military families, is they moved. And then the insurance is different, and they can't come, you can't do any more work with them. You might try and call to have connectivity, but they often just start, they're gone. Poof! And then who knows what happens after that. When it comes, so I'm just going to, we have 5, so I'm going to start racing through. In terms of individual interventions, just briefly, you all know this, you want to look at the etiological factors. Is it genetic? Is it moral? Is it social? Is it systemic? You might have your viewpoint that it's a little bit of both. You might have a viewpoint that it's a disease model only. Wherever your orientation is, that's up to you. Where are they with the stage of change, and how can you work on motivational interviewing to get them further along? There's medications, I'm sure you're all familiar with those, and then approaches, behavioral control, 12-step, harm reduction, social skills, and on and on and on. I'm a big 12-stepper, that's where I go, that's how I teach, that's what I do. And then obviously getting the family involved. And then you want to make sure these military families, especially with substance abuse, have support. With the kids, you want to make sure to help them with this, they have extracurricular activities, get them in sports. Keeps them so much more clean, I think. Get There's group therapy they can go to, which is psychoeducational learning. There's counseling, just to kind of get around other people who are going through it. And then psychotherapy, if they are dual diagnosis and they do have substance abuse as well as bipolar or depression or anxiety, which how often is, I think dual diagnosis has been determined to be 80% at this point. And then you can get military support on the installations. There's a SART program, which is for substance abuse. With the Navy, there's Fleet and Family Services with the Navy, and there's MCCS, and there's more and more and more. It was a big initiative by Obama to really get a lot of family support systems out there in the military installations. And then there's 12-step programs, which again, that's where I am. And there's Alateen, Al-Anon, MA, CA. There's every kind of A in the world, and I highly encourage, especially with the Al-Anon, Alateen. That's just really helpful for the kids. And then lastly, I want to just mention quickly prevention. So if you can target what's going on ahead of the game, that's really helpful. There's 3 different tiers of prevention. The universal is basically everyone. You want to deter everyone from going to deterioration. Selective, which is called secondary prevention. This is where you want to be highly aware. This is where military kids are falling into because it's basically targeting high-risk groups or sublets of the general population that are believed to be at high risk due to a membership of a particular group. Military. They're always at secondary, at least in the selective prevention category. And then indicated is for people who are already engaging and really there already. But you can still do prevention work. So what kinds of things can you do? This is what Focus was all about. It's resiliency training. And this is what our practice does as well. And it's great for military teens and adolescents. It's adapting to the context of adversity, having the ability, I use the tree, I've always used the tree. So it's the idea that if you're the tree, you have the roots are grounded into, with nourishment, a great foundation, which would be support, family, social skills. That keeps you rooted and keeps you strong, keeps you, the tree trunk healthy, keeps the leaves sprouting, and then the adversity is the tough weather. And if you have that great resiliency, you can bend and flex with that, and if you don't, you'll snap and break. So the idea is building tools ahead of time. So problem solving, being able to do really positive functioning at high risk situations, weighing options, implementing solutions, having really strong social competence, which means communication skills, assertiveness training, and having a sense of purpose, which is huge, right? Because lots of people, that's that big empty gap or hole inside of us. So helping them find out what success and purpose would look like for them. So, invest in a team, impact the world, and I think we've got 1 minute left. So thank you. If anyone has any questions.